I put some time into building a program that will help people get better at stone lifting if you don't have access to stones, right? The reality will come down to it is you can train your body as much as you like, and you can try and simulate stones as much as you like, but the only way to get really good at them is to lift stones, right? Now that goes back. Justice Marini has no friends.
I'm just pumped to have you, man. How are you?
Good, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah. And just so people know, it's Caveman.DaveMan is on Instagram. And then you have a podcast called Stones of Strength, I believe. Yes?
Yeah, the Stones of Strength podcast. I do that with my brother Dale. That's right.
Okay, awesome. Here's kind of what, all right. So I saw your stuff on Instagram and I was like, what in the world? But I was the only other place, and I know you're familiar because I think you interviewed this guy's like best friend, but Strength Unknown. I watched that. My family and I would watch it, and they did one where the guys were doing the stone, like lifting stones. And I don't know what it was, but his friend, who I think might be Filipino or wherever, just the shorter guy.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was, but when he lifted those stones, I felt emotion, like I wanted to cry. And I didn't know why. Maybe it's the way he edited it with the music hit just right. But there was something about it, and that's when it clicked for me. Like, I think I know why people do it, but it's so different.
It is, yeah.
I was like, I gotta talk to Dave because I want to understand, how did you get into it, and why you've stuck with it, because it doesn't look easy.
No, it's not easy, man, and that's part of why I really like it, right? So I guess the big thing it's called natural stone lifting or historical stone lifting, right? And it's the way I describe it is kind of the intersection point of archaeology and professional strongmen, right? Because they do use natural stones in World's Strongest Man competitions. They just had the Arnold's, which is one of the biggest the biggest sporting festival in the world, and one of the biggest strongman competitions, and they finished it off with a natural stone to shoulder, right? So it's kind of, even as far as the professional strongman world goes, it's kind of, I don't want to say the word feared, but it's one of the most well-respected events because it's so challenging. And a great example of that is they did this natural stone in 2018 Arnold's, which is the strongman competition, and everyone's familiar with Halfthor Mountain, the game, from the Game of Thrones, Halfthor Bjornsson, right? Like he's one of the most popular strongmen, and the dude deadlifts like 1,100 pounds, but he couldn't get a 400-pound stone in his lap, right? So for the reference of the difficulty factor, right? And so there's a huge a strength and skill curve with this kind of stuff. So it's a really unique world in that respect. And yeah, so it's just a really, really cool spot to be in.
How did it find you? Because it's not, okay, so I live in Austin, Texas. It's not like I could just go find a stone, whatever. Like, and I don't feel like it's something that, like in life, I'll know people that if I see a big, strong dude, I'll go, oh, he lifts weights. Like, obviously, he probably goes to the gym. He probably does stuff. I would never look at a guy and go, oh, yeah, part of his strength, maybe he's into lifting natural stones, So how did you find it out? And why did it stick to, like, with you? Like, I'm sure a lot of people come through and try it out and they're like, not for me, or whatever it is. Like, for whatever reason. How did you discover it? And then what does it do for you personally? Like, why is it something that it attracts you and keeps you doing it?
Yeah, and that's a really good and really fair question, because it is kind of in the more obscure strength world. My family heritage is Scottish, and so the Highland Games is something that goes way, 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 way back. And stone lifting is something commonly found in the Highland Games. Like, even if have you seen the movie Braveheart?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, most people have seen Braveheart, and so there's a scene in there where they say the English won't let us train with weapons, so we train with rocks, right? And there's the scene where the big guy does the stone put, right? And so that's kind of a reference to the Scottish stone lifting history, and it's very, very strong. I've been there. I've lifted many of their historical stones, and so it's a very Scottish heritage. It's also, and we'll get into it, it's everywhere else in the world as well, but being somebody who's very proud of the Scottish heritage that I come from, I've always known about it a little bit. And, I've competed in strength sports since 2016. I started powerlifting, and then I got into strongman. And so, as I mentioned before, stone lifting is something involved in strongman. And so kind of the historical side of it started crossing over into what I actually like to do physically. There's a very, very good documentary called Stoneland out there. It's done by Rogue, which is, they're one of the biggest strength companies on the planet. And they filmed it in, I believe, 2017 or 2016. And so that is my first exposure to the depths of historical stone lifting. So I watched that and, the bagpipes are going and I'm amped, right? And so those stones you were talking about, that were lifted by, and man, my brain is just farting so hard right now. I'm trying to think of his name. He was on our podcast, and I'm just absolutely brain farting on Martin Lisi's buddies' names, and I'm so sorry I'm forgetting it. Anyways, those stones that he lifted that you're talking about, they're called the Dinnie stones, and they're a combination of two lifts, and they're 733 pounds together. And so this documentary is somewhat loosely based around those stones, as well as some of the actual natural stones in Scotland. And so I saw that before COVID. And I went, man, like I gotta give this a go. So I started training and then COVID hit and took a dump on everybody's world, right? And so everything kind of got pushed back. And when that happened, strongman competitions were shut down, powerlifting was shut down. And so I went into my garage and I started taking up an even more obscure thing called steel bending, where it's kind of a mixture of grip strength and old-timey strongman. And so basically I was in my garage snapping bolts and horseshoes, and I set a world record for breaking horseshoes with my hands. And so I developed the look on your face is good. Yeah, it's super. It was weird, man. Like it's you basically take a horseshoe and the rules are you're allowed to put wraps around them. They're 5-inch by 10-inch wraps. It's a specific thing, and it's a specific horseshoe. And I bent it enough times with my hands that I snapped it in a world record time. And so I have an official world record for that. And another of some pretty decent snaps and bends. And so doing that throughout COVID really developed my grip and wrist strength. And so when stone lifting came around to me, it was presented to me by a local guy who ran competitions for stone lifting. And I was like, you know what, I got to give that a try. I had the interest in going to Scotland to do the stones, and with my strength background, and I gave it a try, and it just clicked for me. It's something for. I'm trying to get around to the original question.
I love this, by the way. Don't feel I'm like all in, man. This is crazy.
Sorry, I'm just ranting here, man. But
I love it.
The reason that it stuck with me so well is that it's the history side of being a proud Scottish Canadian, right? Like that's always when you're Canadian, we're kind of a mix of people from all over the world, which is part of what makes Canada so beautiful. But when you are a mix, there's certain parts of your heritage that you really want to hold close to you, and being Scottish is one of them for me. And so you combine the interesting family history and my love of strength sport, and I happen to be quite naturally good at it because of my background and all the wrist and grip strength from doing steel bending and the strength in the rest of my body from strongman and powerlifting. So it kind of was the perfect mix for me. And so I entered in a stone lifting competition. I was the smallest out of 20 guys. It was open weight, and I won it against guys that are like 110, 120 pounds heavier than me.
You won it.
Oh yeah, I've won 2 out of 3, and the one that I didn't win, I lost by 1 point out of 55, and I actually won more of the events than the guy that won. So it was just like a weird counting thing. It's the way it works. It's the way that the competitions go. But so yeah, so it's something that I really like and I'm somewhat naturally good at. And so that kind of secured it for me. And then the more and more I learned about the history of it all over the world, like the company that did that company Rogue that did Stoneland also did one called Fullstyrker, which is about the Icelandic stones of strength. And then there's one called Levantadores about some of the lifters in the Basque Country in Spain. And so as you start to learn about this, you go, man, this is cool. So this seems to be everywhere. In 2022, I actually went to Scotland to lift the Dinnie stones and had a very successful lift. And I went with my parents and my brother I do the podcast with. And my grandpa, who's from Scotland, had passed away that year. And so we actually took his ashes. And as we went around to all these major historical sites throughout the country, we spread his ashes. So it was like a really wicked family trip, right? And yeah, it's cool, right? And so that's
incredible.
Yeah, thank you, man. Like it just meant a lot all around, right? And to be successful in all these lifts and to go to some of these places, I think I was the 7th person to even lay hands on one of these stones in the modern age, right? So in these stones, This one I'm speaking of, it's way up north in Scotland where the Vikings came down and fought the Picts. And the Picts were some of the most badass warriors. They're the only people that have like held off the Romans, right?
Yeah.
These crazy, naked, painted blue dudes, they held off the Vikings too. And so it's land where the Picts and the Vikings mixed. And like just down the road from where this ancient stone is an ancient, it's called a Brock, but it's an ancient Pictish building that's still in great shape from 2,200 years ago. So you're like intertwined in the history of this country as you go to do this stuff. And so that from so many angles, like just like sunk in deep, right?
Okay. There's so
Yeah.
many questions. All right.
I know. I'm gonna hold off. I'm just rambling.
Oh my gosh, I love this. The questions that were kind of running through my mind is you're saying that was powerlifting and like steel bending. And when I saw you do so much of this, I was like, gosh, his grip strength has to be unreal. Like just the 733 pound, like it looked like you had like a homemade Denny Stones. Like you had I looked at it, I was like, there's plates in there, but there's also like I don't know, there's like dumbbells or something. There was like something else. There was other, it was like homemade Denny's. Like it was really, I was like, well, that makes it awkward, which I would feel like makes it harder. So then grip strength, balance, and then all this other stuff. So I'm wondering, what are the like, do you still do like this kind of a lift? Do you have to every day come in and focus on that? Or are you going to the gym still? Or are you like, how do you get better at it if you have to make all your own stuff, basically, like cobble all this stuff together? And then where do you find your own stones? Like, are you fortunate to live in a place where there's just stones that are big enough to challenge? Like, and you had them in your gym. And then, and so I'm wondering, like, what do you have to do to get better at it? Like, how does that work? I saw on your Instagram that I could go and like take a strength program, I believe. But I was like, who taught you how to do it? Like, whose program would you take? Is it like some old Irish guy that's like doesn't have internet that's up there and you just go live with them like a monk for, a year and like learn the ways? Like, how did you, does that make sense? It's just like,
Yeah,
how do
I
you
understand,
get
man.
there?
It's a generalized confusion that a lot of people have with this kind of thing, right? Yeah, there's I guess a couple things in that is so when you saw me do the Denny lifts in my gym with all that stuff, so those are called loading pins and they're pretty commonly used in strongman for this kind of thing to prep for it.
Okay.
So that was something that I used to prep for the actual my Denny Stone attempt, a year and a half ago, and so yeah, that is one of those things. The Denny stones specifically are something you kind of just have to train Denny stones to get good for. It's a very specific thing. It's definitely tough on the hands. There was the last time I did it, which is a couple weeks ago. There's this really rad dude named Chris Scalgram, and he's from the UK. And whenever he's in town for work, he comes by and we train. And he'd never done it before, and he wanted to try it. And he tore his hands absolutely apart on it. Like there was blood everywhere all over the gym because he ripped it in 3 different spots because it's just tough on your hands, and my hands are quite calloused and it's very cold and dry here in Canada, so your hands get pretty tough just because of the environment, right? And so that's one that to get there are definitely freaks out there that can walk up and do a great attempt their first try. There's always going to be those exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, when you're flying that far to try something, you want to be prepared. I knew the basics of it, and I hired a coach named Ryan Stewart. He's one of the guys that's been on the podcast. He's an ex-professional Highland Games athlete and just very knowledgeable. So for that first stone tour, I used him to help prepare me because I didn't know what I was getting into, right? Like I knew I could lift stones here, but he'd been there and lifted those stones and he was experienced. And so I wanted to put my effort in the hands of somebody who knew more than me at that time. And I mean, he still knows more than me now, but I've learned a lot since then is what I'm saying. Now, as for lifting stones in general, how do you get better at it? There's definitely many ways to do it. I put out a free program just a few days ago for people because I get that question a ton. And, unfortunately, in the internet culture, there's a lot of paywalls for people to excel at things, right? People charge so much for programming and coaching, and I don't think that's the way it should be. So I put some time into building a program that will help people get better at stone lifting if you don't have access to stones, right? The reality will come down to it is you can train your body as much as you like and you can try and simulate stones as much as you like, but the only way to get really good at them is to lift stones, right? Now that goes back to the point I made, with Hapler Bjornsson and these world's strongest men who are just not Like I'm lifting stones as heavy as the strongest humans in the world, right? So they're using their high level one that they use in that competition is 408 pounds. Some of the guys can stand with it, and I'm standing with 408 here, right? Because I've worked at it and there's skills to it, right? Like there's a technique to using a fork if you think about it, right?
Yeah.
So of course there's going to be a technique to lifting stones. And if you don't put your effort into it, you're not going to be good at it, right? And so you need to get exposure to that. And so actually 2 years ago, we started something called the Edmonton Stones of Strength. So that's where I'm from, is Edmonton, Alberta. Because
Yeah.
outside of the competition my buddy held, there's no stone lifting culture here. And we wanted to develop our own stones here because not everyone can travel across the world to lift, right? So we live in an area where the ice age hit pretty hard. There's woolly mammoths and all that shit all around here. And so there was a giant glacial lake here in Edmonton. My brother's actually a geologist, which is why I know this stuff.
Whoa. I was about to say, I was like, gosh, man, what
Yeah.
in the world?
Heck, what's this guy
Yeah.
going on? So there was a glacial lake here in the end of the last ice age, and when it broke, it left a whole bunch of stones here. So we're definitely lucky with how much we actually have at our disposal. But that being said, man, people can find them anywhere, and that's something like I really want to put out there is this dude hit me up on Instagram, and I don't remember his name, but he's from Queens, New York. And he's telling me he saw some guys in local parks in Queens, New York doing stone lifting there. So if you can find stones in the concrete jungle of New York, then no one's got excuses, right? Like
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
right, like most parks or playgrounds are going to have it. There's going to be landscaping stores, you can go buy them. You can always find them. Find a riverbed. There's always, you just got to put the work in, right? Like I've spent countless dozens of hours digging, weighing, finding good ones, because just because you find a heavy rock doesn't mean it's going to be a good one to lift, right? So I've put
Mm,
the time in, and that's why I have access to so many, is because we've put the sweat equity into building really good stones here.
yeah.
We were very fortunate to be featured in GQ magazine last year about it. There's a really cool article on the historical stones of Ireland, and we're featured in that for modern stone lifting. We were filmed by a really big company. Documentaries coming out later this year. We got a big national in Canada called the Globe and Mail. Like a lot of this stuff's really becoming popular. And so it's really fun to be a part of it. We're kind of catching the wave at the right time. Not that none of that is our goal. Like I would have, if you would have
Yeah.
asked me 2 years ago when I had this idea, like, 2 years from now, you're going to be featured on podcasts, you're going to be in national newspapers, you're going to be in documentaries on masculinity, you're going to be in GQ. I would have laughed and said, there's not a chance, man. I've got no interest in doing that. That's not why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
But the reason that I like actually like going on to these things and talking about it is because I hope it crosses someone's path that it can open their minds up into going to do it as well, because it's uh it's a really cool thing. And you'd asked the question before about not everyone maybe connects with it, and I've been with a lot of people their first time, and you're right, there's some people that just go, yeah man, that's a heavy rock, okay, like that's challenging. But there's some people they grab it and they lift it and you just see it click and they go, yeah, okay, I get it. Like it's like it's in your DNA. Nobody picks up does a deadlift or a squat for the first time and goes, yeah, like you're like, yeah, that was really hard, right? That was a hard thing to lift. But
Yeah.
there's something about that, like David Keown, who's the gentleman in Ireland who is doing all the research over there. He goes, it's the bones of man versus the bones of the earth, and you can feel it in your DNA. And it's like, yeah, man, if you know, and that's like he put it so well that's it. Like it just connects with you.
Have you always been naturally strong? Would you say like I've always had an ability to lift heavier than the average like person, whether it's high school or whenever you got into it, where you're like, I have a natural ability here. Like, as I'm hearing you, I'm like, dude, you're winning steel bending competitions. There's something natural here. Would you say that's true, or would you say like, no, I just,
Yeah.
you know,
It's a combination of everything, man. Like
yeah,
I would say that I'm fortunate. My parents are in their late 60s and they're still running Ironman triathlons. So I come from a really athletic family. I'm from a family of three boys. We all grew up wrestling, playing hockey. So I'm a lifelong athlete. And like I was always the littlest guy.
mm,
I'm not big now. I'm 5'10", 210, right? So in the strongman world,
yeah,
that's still small, but I was always really, really little. So I spent my life swinging up, right? So when I was wrestling, I was always drilling against guys bigger than me. And so I would say that I probably got stronger than the average that way. And I think so, but then there's also, I would have to say, a genetic element to it too. Like my brother that I do the podcast with, his first time stone lifting, he lifted a massive stone that, like, I got a buddy and he's competed in the worlds for strongman, and he's the same size as my brother. And my brother, his first time trying stone lifting, can lift a heavier stone than this guy who's competed at worlds for strongman. So there's like, yeah, it's wild. My brother's a freak. So there's a natural element that I think that maybe we have some genetics for that stuff, but genetics can get you so far. That's when the work comes in, right? And so you still have to work really hard to be good at anything. Anybody does, right?
Yeah, 100%. Oh, geez, man. I'm like, this is crazy. Are there, if I was to get into powerlifting or if I was to get into a lot of these things, it'd be really well known what injuries to be aware of. It's like your shoulders, right? It's like you got to get your shoulders good, especially when it comes to other stuff. Hey, lower back, like just got to understand the right, form and it's pretty well known
Sure.
what injuries happen, even if you weren't into the sport or the activity.
Right.
But when it comes to stone lifting, the only thing I can think of is like, don't drop it on your foot.
Yeah.
But what is like what are like common injuries that happen there? Or what are the things that you maybe weren't prepared for that you had to skill up? Like you're like, I didn't see this being the challenge of becoming better at stone lifting. Now that I'm in it, I'm like, oh man, I gotta really, like when I was getting into like trying to get my bench press up,
Mhm.
it was like, okay, you got to get your form, all that stuff. But the thing that I heard was like, if you're not getting your triceps stronger, you're limiting your bench. So
Or
just,
your back, even. Back is often
yeah,
neglected. People
yes,
don't realize how important your back is in a bench press because they
yeah.
think it's a press, so it's all frontal plane. But no, you got to control that weight down by pulling it in with your back, right?
Oh my gosh. That's kind of what I'm asking with, gosh, you
Yeah.
know about everything. What is it in stone lifting that is like, hey, this is what you got to really work? Because it's such an awkward movements. Um, And so what is the thing that you came in and you're like, I didn't know I had to be stronger here, that I really have to get stronger?
There's a few things. So I'll touch on, you mentioned injuries. Like injuries is one of the things. And so this will cross over to the strength side of it. Uh,
Yeah.
it's a really, really low injury sport. And the reason for that is because your wrist and grip are your limiting factor, right? For most people, if you can deadlift 400 pounds, right? Let's just say, which is something I think most people with a bit of work can get to 400 pounds.
Yeah.
It's a good lift. It's not crazy. My job is I'm a fireman, and so I work with a lot of quite strong dudes, and I think that most healthy men should be able to get to a 400-pound, right? So let's say that that's still a pretty good deadlift. If you can lift a 300-pound stone, you're really strong. Okay,
Mm.
so the thing that goes on most people is their wrist because it's so difficult to find the balance points and the holds. And so what's going to give out is you're just going to lose your grip before your back gives out. Does that make sense? And so,
Oh, 100.
you can strap up with a deadlift and you can blow your back out pulling something quite easily because you're yanking, you're not using proper form. Whereas a stone actually encourages you to use proper form, because if your form isn't there, again, back to that Hafthor Bjornsson thing,
Yeah.
he, I think, tried 4 or 5 times to get a stone that's 40% of his deadlift up to his lap, and he couldn't do it because it kept rolling and he would lose the balance. So because it's so technical,
Mm.
the risk of injury is quite low. Now, as you get the form and you start going up, right? Like I'm at a point now where I'm chasing a 400-pound stone to shoulder. Now we're getting in the territory of where you can hurt your back, right? So that's where there's a lot of things that come to it. But I think the biggest thing for me that I wasn't expecting, it's very, I don't know what word to use for it other than grit. Okay. Because if you picture a deadlift, say, have you done much deadlifting before?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. So how long does a max deadlift take? Maybe 4 seconds, right?
Yeah.
Five
No, no, it's
seconds,
not long. Yeah. It's not. Yeah.
right? So a max stone lift can take 40 seconds, right? There's nothing in the strength world that a one single max effort of anything takes you that long. Even if you look at the Olympic lifters, they're extraordinarily powerful. If you look at the clean and press, they take their time with the lift, but it's not that long, right? I've had 40-second attempts on my max stone to shoulder. I put a 380 on my shoulder, and I think it was like a 30-second lift. So there's a certain level of grit you need, and you have to be very comfortable. Like when you have 38, I'm 210 pounds. Having 380 pounds on your chest while you're trying to patiently breathe and hike it up, you go past the power and the strength output. You go to a point where it's grit, where you have to dig deep And grit is an element of strength that isn't discussed as much, but it absolutely falls into it. You can make an argument that sure, it's partially your anaerobic capacity, it's your ability to tolerate low oxygen and high carbon dioxide in your blood. Of course, you can do that. But if we were to round it out, I think the word grit is probably what's appropriate. So I never foresaw the grit that is required for some of these max
Mm.
effort lifts. And once I found that, that's when I started making massive jumps. Like I went from a 325-pound stone to shoulder max to a 380 in a few months. I didn't get that much stronger because that's a massive gap.
Yeah.
That kind of gap in deadlifts isn't as much, but with stones, it's huge. But I just got better at tolerating the discomfort of the stone on the chest and learning how to breathe and learning how to actually, like, that's one thing I also learned in steel bending is we have fail safes in our body. We have a governor in our brain that goes, this is uncomfortable, this hurts, and it stops sending signals to your muscles that say fire. So you've got to retrain your body to be able to fire those muscles when everything up here in your brain is telling you to stop doing it.
Whoa. Did you just learn that by doing it more? Or like it's
Yeah.
kind of they say the same thing about like holding your breath, right?
Yes.
That
Sure. Of
it's
course.
like, hey, like go up for breath and you got to train that system that hey, you're only at like 60%. There's
Yes.
way more in here than you need. So people just go and do it more. So for you, that's a big leap in like in weight. And so did you do that just by doing it more, or were there other exercises or things you did to get that grit?
Yes. So basically, it was just spending more time with stones on my chest. I wanted to get better at stone lifting to the shoulder, right? Because I hadn't put a lot of effort into it. So instead of just doing single lifts, I would hold it on my chest for 10 seconds, learn to be comfortable breathing it, and then finish the lift. So it's more about drilling within the specific movements than for something as very specific as stone to shoulder. There's no way to simulate stone to shoulder with any barbell, any dumbbell, anything. You can use sandbags, you could use an atlas stone, you can use natural stone. Those are kind of your options, right? So, you can get better off the floor or putting wind beneath the stone, it's called when you just get it off the ground by working deadlifts. Sure, all that stuff will go over. But when it comes to actually shouldering, you need to be pretty specific with it. So it's basically just variations of the movements.
Would you say that that's like something that your family has a gift in? Because as I'm hearing you, I'm like, even wrestling is a grit thing. Like
Oh, it's huge. Yeah.
it's like the amount of on so many levels, just staying in the weight class, overcoming just wanting to eat, just the sweat, the how much you're just under pressure and just fighting another guy. Your muscles want to give out, but you've got to stay in the zone. You got to keep going. It's like so mental and so like just training your body to not submit, to just
Sure.
keep going, like mental. And then I'm hearing about your parents are like still doing Ironmans and like that's not easy.
No,
Um,
it's crazy.
is that something you've noticed in your family that and like being a fireman, like again, like it's just like when you're going into a place that your mind would tell you probably shouldn't go into this place, like it's on fire. We leave places like that.
Yeah.
Um, so do you feel like that's like is that a thing in your family? Like, is that something you've noticed? Like, we have a natural capacity to either chase something that requires it, or we tend to live better in the fire than maybe some other people, and everyone has their gift. Have you noticed that?
I would imagine it's a combination of everything.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to say. Like it's nature versus nurture. Sure, my parents grew up being good athletes, and obviously we inherited some of their genes. But also the nurture side of it is we grew up watching our parents' dedication to their athletics, and we were
Mhm.
fortunate, and they encouraged us, right? Like we were very privileged in the opportunities for sports we had, and it was it was something very important growing up. And so it's a combination of everything. I think most things in life are a hybrid of everything, right? And so, yeah, I mean, seeing my brother, his first training session lifting such a massive stone with no training whatsoever, you're kind of like, okay, maybe there's a natural gift. And like, I think my second stone lifting session, I stood with a 375-pound stone, which people can work for a very long time and never do that once. And I was weighing 198 pounds at that time. So I think we have maybe a natural, the word gift is lame, but like, I think we maybe the lifetime of the sports that we've done has helped to add up to being where we are. I'm not
Yeah.
really, I haven't
Yeah.
given too much thought, to be honest, man, but I'm just guessing. I'm spitballing here.
It's incredible. I'm just like watching all these places that all these things and these activities that require living under pressure.
Sure.
Like being able to step into pressure and go, all right, mind, I know you want to give up, or you want to do whatever, but let's sustain, but also chasing those. Like, it's one thing to be like, all right, I got to do it. It's another one to be like, I'm pursuing activities that require it. It's
That's
very
very good.
interesting.
It's a trainable thing. I think
Yeah.
it is. So I think maybe some of those things come a little bit more naturally, like switching into that gear. It's something that really helps. It's something that I've done, before lifts and powerlifting and strongman competitions. Like the world shuts down, you get really good at focusing. And that's something that I think is very, very trainable, and people need to learn to master their mind. And so that's definitely something that helps, that I would encourage people to do. Because if you know how to, like, go, quote unquote, go there, right? And that's something you've developed in your training sessions, the mental side of all of these things are huge, right? Like when I stepped up to do those Denny Stone lifts, or whenever I've done an event in a competition, I've done it 100 times in my mind already. I
Mm.
knew what I'm doing. Like I'm very specific about my preparation for things. Because I'm not a big guy, and when I'm competing in these open weight competitions, and there's guys that got over 100 pounds on me, and they can rely on brute strength. I can't, right? So you got to be a tactician. You've got to master the movements. You've got to master your mind. And if you've stepped up to something and you've done it already a dozen times, 100 times in your head type thing, it's going to be that much easier because now you just go through the motions of what you've already done.
Do you enjoy stepping into these places as, in some ways, an underdog? Like, do you enjoy that? Like, is it kind of like, oh, like I love, like, I know they're looking at me going, good luck, and just like wait. And then there's a part of me that's like, do you enjoy seeing people lose their will when you're competing against them? Like, I'm just thinking, like, there's a big burly guy. He's looking like, oh yeah, I came in first last time, or yeah, I'm this. And this guy comes in. I could just see that he's looking on paper, weight and just size, and going, oh crap, and him just losing his will. That like just kind of like, oh, and knowing, oh, this is so much of this is mindset. Like I'm mentally moving ahead here. Like, do you enjoy it, or are you just like, dude, I just come in, I do my job, and I get out?
Yeah, it's more so that, like, I try and actually encourage like these competitions that I've done are so fun. And
Yeah.
I would actually rather see somebody do their absolute best, and even if
Yeah.
they beat me, because that's what's fun in it, right? And so I would rather, like, it's always cool when you catch someone off guard where they go, whoa, shit, didn't expect
Yeah.
that, right? But it's I would just rather see everybody do really, really well, because that's when it's more fun.
Yeah.
For sure. That
Yeah.
would be
I would be so demoralized if like I've
yeah,
been doing it for years, and then you know
a
I'm
little weird
bigger and
comes in.
everything, and then this tactician comes in and is like, all right.
Yeah, this is how to be efficient. Yeah, there's for sure,
Yeah.
man. Yeah, it's a
Okay.
fun element, of course. Who doesn't like being a bit of an underdog? But after that first year, I kind of wasn't really the underdog anymore. And yeah, it's fun though. The competitions were a lot of fun. They're actually becoming quite popular. There's a lot of them around these days, which is awesome.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll be looking some of them up. All right. Last, I got just a few questions, and then I know you've got stuff going on. Thanks again for
No,
making
it's good,
time.
brother. We're good.
Uh, Gosh, I want to talk a little bit about grip strength,
Sure.
um, and the wrist. So, um, how is grip strength, is training for grip strength? Like I see people put their hands in rice, and there's all kinds of stuff for that. Um, does that, by doing that, when people talk about grip strength, does that naturally strengthen your wrist, or are there other things that really focus on the wrist, on wrist strength? Because I've never heard about wrist strength until talking to you today.
Yeah.
Um,
They're not
and
the same.
so, oh, really?
Definitely not. Not at all. So grip is a very complicated thing. There's so many different elements to grip. You can have a guy, you see those hand crushers, everybody knows about those. Those make you good at doing that. There's
Mm,
so many, if you look at grip competitions, they test all sorts of things, from your thumb strength to your more open hand to your closed hand. Like there's a lot of elements to grip, and you can be just a stud at one of these things, but dog shit at another, right? So grip is a very broad thing. Now, wrist isn't something that usually people talk about as much. There's a local strongman who we know each other through the community a bit, and he's a professional strongman, really good dude. But we were talking about stones, and he said next time he's in Edmonton, he's going to come train because that's one of the things he lacks. And I asked him where he gets caught. He goes, getting it off the ground. I asked him what he does for wrist training, and he goes, what do you mean? Like, so here we have a professional strongman with a professional strongman coach, and he's never once even discussed wrist strength training, right? So there's a massive gap for a lot of people because there's certain grip things like you discussed the rice bucket thing. I got right on the other side of this wall, I got a bucket of rice that I use for it. Now, rice bucket can help because when you're doing it and you're rotating around, you're working your flexors and your extensors. Rice buckets are actually fantastic for helping people with tendonitis because pretty much everything we do in the world is closing our fingers, right? What movement do you ever do that's opening your fingers unless you're giving someone a high five? You don't, right? So your actual flexors are completely neglected. And so that's what happens when people get tendonitis, whether you hear tennis elbow, golf elbow, everything they're doing, they're closing their hand and they're not working their flexors. Their extensors, they're only working their flexors. So that's why rice buckets are actually really helpful for the wrist, is because it helps prevent tendonitis and it actually allows you to work all of the muscles on your flexors and your extensors that run through your wrist into your hands. So that actually is a really good one. Now, other than that, most people don't do any wrist training whatsoever unless you are a grip athlete or if you're an arm wrestler. Because that's one thing that I've always found when I wanted to get good at something, I went to the best people in the world at that one thing, right? So when I wanted to start getting stronger wrists, I looked at what do arm wrestlers do and what do grip strength and steel bending athletes do, right? If I wanted to get better at a back squat, I'm not looking at the CrossFitter, I'm looking at the power lifter, right? So you have to look at the people that are the best at what they do and then see what they do to get to be the best, right? And so wrist strength is something I learned a lot from watching arm wrestlers. You're doing a lot of wrist rotations. I do a ton of work with sledgehammers, and there's lots of stuff you can do. There's a guy named Dan Strauss. He is the Raspberry Ape on Instagram. And I would encourage, if anybody wants to learn about wrist strength, go check his page out. The dude is a world-class jiu-jitsu fighter. He runs a whole bunch of gyms. He's a commentator. He's unbelievable. And he puts out a ton of information on grip stuff. And so he's the guy to go check it out. Him and I do a lot of very similar stuff. Like I put out a video where I just use a natural stone. I drill a hole and use lift plates off of that. And he messaged me, he's like, dude, I've been thinking about that for years. And then he did it after, right? So like him and my mind were very similar in kind of more obscure training methods, but obscure is not a bad thing, right? Like I'm talking, I do a lot of weird stuff for my wrists, and you got a professional strongman who doesn't do anything for his wrists. Well, guess whose wrists are stronger? The guy that does the weird stuff, right?
Yeah,
So when
yeah.
you stop giving a shit about what looks a little bit off, that's when you can really unlock a lot of things. Like steel bending. That's the weirdest sounding thing ever. And even while I was doing it, I'm like, what am I doing? This is so weird. But then
Yeah.
crazy strength from doing it, right? Because you're doing things that are a little bit out of the norm, but then you
Wow.
get strength that's out of the norm, right?
I love that. Yeah, I had never heard of steel bending until we talked today. I was like,
Yeah, there's a lot. It's not popular in Canada and in the States as much. Over in Europe, they have a whole different strength culture in Europe. It's very, very different. Like they've got all sorts of like powerlifting meets here are squat, bench, deadlift. They obviously have that over there, but they also have competitions with trap bar deadlift and one arm deadlift and a whole bunch of stuff. The history over there is a lot different, and therefore the culture of lifting is much, much different over there.
what is your goal in this arena, like long term? Like, what is your biggest hope? Because it's not every day that someone has a podcast, Stones of Strength, like around it. So it feels like, and I might be making some assumptions that you have a bigger vision for this. If so, like, what is it?
Okay, I'm trying to think how to word it. So there's my physical goals, like
Yeah.
for the feats that I want to accomplish,
Yeah.
and that would be separate from what you're discussing with the podcast. So the reason that we made the podcast is because we're nerds and fan of this activity. If there was a podcast about stone lifting, we'd be listening to it, but there wasn't. So we're like, I guess we're making one because we just want to talk to people, right? Like the conversation we're having, this is fun. It's nice to talk to people about things that are cool, right? And
Yeah.
so the podcast is honestly just it's a passion project. It's great time with my brother. It's fun. We get to talk to like amazing people and fascinating people from around the world that have actually discovered Like we didn't get too much into the history of any of this stuff, but it's mind blowing some of this stuff. So it's just that is a fun thing that we can learn and talk to people about. Now, the physical uh, goals are a little different. Like next year, I'm going to Iceland for my 40th birthday because I'm old. I'm almost 40. And so there's stuff that I want to do there. There's something called full sturker. Are you familiar with what full sturker is?
No, please tell me.
Okay. So as I mentioned, so all over the world, there's a history of stone lifting. Okay. This is a human universal. But as the months go on, more and more research is coming out about these ancient stones. I mean, all stones are ancient, they're a million years old, but I mean their actual fundamental use and their cultural significance. More and more research is being discovered. And there's some of these guys that I know that are just amazing researchers. Anyways, in Iceland, they had something called fullstyrker. It meant full man. And so if you look throughout cultures, like in Scotland, they were called manhood stones, some of them. So what it would mean is if part of your clan, so mine was Clan Nisbet, right? That's my last name is a Scottish name. I wore my family's kilt when I was there. So let's say the Nisbet clan had a manhood stone. And when I was a 14-year-old boy, I wanted to start training with weapons. Well, I wasn't allowed to learn to be a warrior until I could lift that stone to a certain height. And then I would be a man, and they were called manhood stones because they allowed you now to train with weapons and become a warrior. Now, there's other ones in Scotland, for instance, where it'd be a chieftain stone. So if you wanted to be a guard of the chieftain, you had to be able to lift this stone. So stones had specific purposes. Now, if you go to Iceland, they have some there called the fisherman's stone. And so there's a beach called Dridvik Beach, and there's a series of 4 different stones. And when you were a fisherman in ancient times, your manhood, your pay, your status would be directly correlated to your strength. So if you couldn't only lift the little one, I think it was a moldy, it means you were basically nothing, you're insignificant. Then there's one size bigger. And then there's half sturker, which means you were half a man. And then full sturker meant full man. So if you could lift the full sturker stone, you would get a better position on the boat. You would get more food. You would get more, if there was raiding done, you would get more of the loot, let's call it,
Yeah.
right? So your actual wealth was very specific and directly related to your strength. So there are a bunch of ancient tests of strength all throughout Iceland. There's 8 as of right now that have been discovered where you can go and you can test yourself if you're full man according to the descendants of the Vikings. So it's wildly cool. It's just really neat. And so there's different tests there. You can go, if you're an average dude, you can go and try some of the basic level ones just to give it a try. But the full sturker status, that's being the best of the best. And so as of right now, there's 8. And so I'm hoping to go and try my strength against all 8. If we can make it there, you never know, depending on the weather and all that stuff.
Oh,
But
sure. Oh my
so
gosh.
that's a long-winded answer to your question of what my personal goal is. So next year, for my 40th, I want to go and do as many of those, the Icelandic traditions.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Oh gosh.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, it's a lot, man. I'm just
I
throwing.
love, don't apologize. This is why I do this. I'm just like, there's so many people doing such cool stuff that you'll never know about unless like
Right.
you'll see it and you go, oh, that's interesting. And you're like, I wonder why they do this or why they do that or why does that happen this way or how'd they get into it? And then you'll just scroll past it instead of like just discovering and finding these like super unique people, which that's
Sure.
you. And it's incredible. And I'm learning so much. And I didn't realize it seems like in history, in all these places that they didn't know of each other, stones were universally known as like a level of manhood or not even like a maybe like a way to discover the level of your manhood by just like in all these places. Yet they didn't know each other. Like they weren't like calling each other and going, how's how are the men over there on their stones?
Yeah.
It's like they just naturally went to it. They were just like, can you lift it?
It's wild, man. It's really, really interesting stuff. Like and all sorts of places, like in Ireland, they would have it the funeral games. So when somebody would die, they would get together, and that's when everybody could flex nuts, so to speak, from the different clans and the cultures and the areas, who was the strongest. Like these things are so linked to people's culture. They just found one in Madagascar that has been used. Like this stuff's everywhere, man. Like it's still the national sport in Tibet. There's parts of Mongolia. It's in, like, dude, when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. There's some up north here in Canada with the Inuit, and like so Japan has 19,000 lifting stones at shrines. They're called chikarishi. And so it's linked to all these cultural things. Like it's fascinating stuff.
Gosh, when you share the first thing when you're sharing all this, I'm like, are you gonna start a YouTube channel and do like your own strength unknown, but just make it like stones unknown? Like it's just like it's so fascinating and there's so much history and all
That's what
this.
actually Strength and Known has done. So it was Romark, pardon me, like I'd forgotten his name
Yeah.
earlier. I feel terrible about it, but Romark and Martin does a great job of doing that. They actually did one in Japan where they went and lifted some of the Chikarishi stones there, and like they've got it in China. Like it's just so cool, man. And that's like
Oh,
I've traveled a lot of the world. Like I've seen some when I was younger and I didn't have kids. I got two young boys now, but like I've been to Easter Island to see those bizarre statues that are buried in the ground, and Machu Picchu and all sorts of places over Asia. And I've always been super curious about human history and traveling to see it. And now the human history is crossing over with my passion of strength, and that's
wow.
why I'm just so hyped on all this stuff. It's just
Oh
so
my gosh. All right. I want to remind this is like, oh, this is awesome. All right. I want to remind everybody, please go check out Caveman.DaveMan on Instagram. Him and his brother have a podcast, Stones of Strength. They can get it anywhere, right? They can just Apple
yeah,
Podcasts,
it's
Spotify.
on everything. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Um, man, thank you. Like this really has been like huge. I've learned so much. Like now I'm definitely getting a rice bucket. Like I
Yeah.
just it's I didn't know about that, and it probably answers a lot of questions that no one really talks about wrist strength. And like I've never heard of wrist strength. I've heard of grip strength. I've never heard of wrist strength. And
It's huge.
I like to think that I listen to a lot of different strength people on podcast and YouTube. Never once have I heard someone talk about wrist strength. Thank you. And if people want to know more, is there like a website you want people to go to? Or you're just like, hey, just follow my journey on Instagram and listen to the
Yeah.
podcast.
They can send me a note. I get back to everybody, man. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to help. Yeah, same with yourself, man. You got any more questions about this stuff, like about wrist strength training, just hit me up and we'll have a chat.
100%. And oh, you did mention a free program. Where would they get that free program on stone lifting or
Yeah, it's
training?
just on my page. The link's in the bio. I did a bunch of videos for everything because some of them are a little bit like they're tweaks on normal movements, and it's a great strength program, and it's more geared towards stone lifting. There's a
Yeah,
lot of good stuff in there though, man. But it's pretty specific to that because the goal of every movement is to make you a better stone lifter or a healthier athlete that's more well balanced for it. So it's pretty
I love
specific.
it.
It's there
I
for
love
everyone.
it. I absolutely love it. You are the man,
Well, thank
Dave.
you, dude.
Thank you for the time. I know it's like meeting with a stranger to talk about stuff, and so
Thank you, man.
and thanks for being up for it. Thanks for all the stuff you do as a fireman, and yeah, man, I'll talk to you later. Thank you so much, and I'll send you everything after it's edited and done. And don't feel any kind of way of if you want to use the reels that get created, feel free. If you don't, I'm not going. You didn't post anything, and don't ever feel like if you choose to post something that you need to. This is all like the joy of doing it. It's not to grow anything big. It is just like showing people how to meet new people and interesting stuff and grow, man.
Yeah, it was
It's
a great chat,
fantastic.
man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet, Dave. All right, man. Have a good one, and we'll
Yeah,
talk
you
again
too,
soon.
man. Have a good day, dude. Bye.
Bye.